I was hiking alone in a part of the forest I hadn't explored before. It was farther off from my usual routes, a bit deeper, and honestly a bit more isolated than I was used to. But that was the point. I had planned this trip because I wanted some real solitude. No other hikers, no trail markers, no distractions. Just thick woods, a quiet path, and the sound of leaves crunching beneath my boots. The map I'd been using was old. I printed it off a blog someone posted years ago. It wasn't detailed and didn't show any real landmarks other than creeks, elevation, and a couple of old forestry paths. I brought a compass, a decent backpack full of food and water, and my tent. But as the sun started to dip low behind the trees and the air got colder, I realized I had misjudged how far I'd gone. I was more tired than I thought I'd be by early evening, and when I checked my GPS, I had no signal at all. Not even a flicker. I knew I could pitch the tent anywhere, but then I noticed something through the trees. A dark shape just past a line of thin pine trunks. It was subtle at first, just a shadow that didn't move like the rest. I stepped off the faint trail and moved toward it, pushing branches aside. A few steps in, I saw it clearer. An old cabin. Small, maybe 2 rooms at most. The roof was sagging and patched with moss and pine needles, but it was standing. There was a rusted stovepipe chimney sticking out the top, and the wood siding was weathered to a dull gray. It was weird. I hadn't expected to find anything man-made out here. The whole point of this hike was to go beyond the known trails. But there it was, tucked into the trees like it had been forgotten for decades. I stood there for a minute, not sure what to think. Part of me wanted to turn back and find a place to pitch the tent. But the thought of having 4 solid walls around me instead of thin nylon was tempting. I told myself I'd just check it out. Maybe take a look inside and see if it was safe. The front steps were rotted, so I walked around to the side and found a flatter piece of wood acting like a ramp. The door was slightly open, just a crack. I pushed it gently, and it groaned on its hinges as it swung inward. The inside was dark and smelled of dust and dry wood. I pulled my flashlight from my pack and clicked it on. The inside was just as small as it looked. 1 main room and a smaller one off to the left, probably meant to be a bedroom. The main room had an old wood stove, a warped table, a single chair, and a cabinet with 1 door missing. There was also a painting on the wall opposite the door, which struck me right away. It was of a family, 2 adults and 2 kids, all dressed in what looked like clothes from the 1950s or maybe earlier. The faces were worn from age, but their eyes were the most visible part. All 4 seemed to be looking straight ahead, and when I moved slightly to the side, I could have sworn their eyes followed me. That gave me pause. I stood still, flashlight beam aimed right at the painting, just watching it. Nothing moved, obviously, but the feeling was strange. It wasn't that the painting was alive or anything stupid like that. It was just the kind of expression that made you uncomfortable, like the way old portraits in museums sometimes look way too realistic. I shook it off and checked the rest of the place. The floor groaned loudly under my boots, especially in the middle of the room. It was uneven, creaky, and clearly unstable in spots. I looked into the smaller room, which was empty except for a collapsed cot and what looked like an old metal bucket. Still, despite how run down it was, the place seemed dry and out of the wind. I decided to stay for the night. I rolled out my sleeping mat near the back corner of the main room, away from the painting, and took a few minutes to eat a cold meal from my pack. Afterward, I lit a candle I'd brought and set it on the table, turning off the flashlight to save the battery. The quiet was heavy. Forest quiet is different from town or house quiet. It's alive in its own way, branches swaying, wind moving through pine needles, distant animal calls. But inside that cabin, the quiet felt unnatural. Not silent, just stifled, like sound didn't bounce the way it should. I noticed I could hear the smallest things, the scratching of a mouse in the wall, the groan of old boards shifting as the cabin cooled in the night air. I tried to read for a bit with the candlelight, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting toward the painting. I was lying on my side, facing away from it, but I still felt like it was behind me, watching. At some point, I got up, walked over, and turned the painting face down against the wall. It made a dry scraping sound as I set it down. I didn't feel paranoid, just uncomfortable. No point staring at those faces all night. Back in my corner, I lay down again, but the sleep didn't come easy. The wind picked up outside, rattling the thin walls. The floor creaked again, not from me moving, just from the structure settling. That's what I told myself, anyway. Then I heard something else. A whisper. It wasn't words. Not really. Just the sound of something low and close to the wall, like wind sneaking through cracks but with a rhythm to it. I held my breath, listening. It came from the far side of the room, near the collapsed cot. I told myself it was the wind, just wind, maybe blowing across a gap in the wall, creating that soft whistle. But it kept happening. Not constant, just now and then. A slow, brushing noise like fabric sliding on wood. Then a few minutes of nothing. Then again. I tried to ignore it, rolled to my other side, and pulled my sleeping bag tighter. But then came the groaning. Not from the walls, this was from the floor. Just a few feet away from me. A single groan, then silence. I sat up slowly and grabbed the flashlight again. I swept the beam across the room. Nothing. The painting was still face down. The door was still closed. Nothing moved. But the groan came again, this time from behind me. I turned quickly, flashlight catching the uneven floorboards. That's when I saw that one of the boards in the corner had a small gap beside it. Not big, just a finger's width. But something about it looked off, like it had been moved recently. The dust around it was disturbed. I got up, walked slowly over, crouched, and aimed the light at the floor. The board wasn't nailed down. I lifted it. Beneath was a shallow space between the joists, maybe a foot deep. There was something inside, a metal tin about the size of a lunchbox. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were a few yellowed photographs, the same family from the painting. There were more people in some of the photos, neighbors maybe, or extended family. All of them looked somber. Nobody smiled. Underneath the photos was a folded up paper. It was a list handwritten in pencil. Names and dates. Some were crossed out. At the bottom, in small letters, was written, "Gone. All gone. Don't let anyone in." My stomach sank a little. I didn't know what I was looking at, but it felt like I was intruding, like I wasn't supposed to see this. I folded the paper and put it back, then placed the tin in the same spot and put the board down. I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed in my sleeping bag with the flashlight on for hours. Every little noise felt sharper, closer. The whispering never really stopped. It just faded and returned like waves. I kept staring at the door, waiting for it to move. Eventually, morning light started to push in through the cracks in the wall. I packed up quickly, didn't eat, didn't use the small metal bucket for anything. I just rolled up my mat, stuffed my gear into the bag, and left the cabin without looking back. Once I was a few hundred feet into the woods, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The sounds of the forest returned. Birds, wind, even a squirrel chattering in a branch above me. The pressure that had built up in my chest slowly started to ease. Took me the whole day to find my way back to familiar trails. When I finally got back to the trailhead, my car was still there. It looked out of place after being in that part of the woods. Clean, modern, real. I sat in the driver's seat for a while before starting it. I didn't know what to make of the night I'd spent in that cabin. I wasn't scared in the way kids are scared of ghosts. I was unsettled, deeply, in a way I couldn't explain. Everything that happened could be explained rationally. The groans from old wood, wind through the walls, the odd feeling of being watched because of that painting. The list in the tin could have just been from someone slowly losing their mind in isolation. None of it had to mean anything, but the feeling stayed with me. I never reported the cabin. I never marked it on any map. I didn't post about it online or try to dig up its history. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want anyone else to either. Some places are better left to rot in the forest. I still hike, still go off trail sometimes. But now I avoid that part of the woods completely. Not because I believe in curses or ghosts, but because something about that place didn't feel empty. It felt abandoned but not unoccupied. There's a difference, and I don't want to find out who or what might still be listening from behind those whispering walls. I used to work as a field tech for a company that did environmental research and maintenance support for state-run properties. It wasn't glamorous work. Mostly, I was assigned to check equipment, maintain small structures like ranger cabins, and collect data from weather stations or wildlife cameras. A lot of the job involved solitude. I didn't mind that part. In fact, I preferred it. In 2019, I was assigned to rotate through a string of remote cabins located deep in a forest reserve up north. The cabins were old but serviceable, basic wooden structures with a cot, a desk, a gas stove, a small propane heater, and a dry latrine nearby. These cabins were mostly used by rangers or researchers passing through. I'd be staying in each one for several days at a time while performing routine maintenance and equipment checks on the surrounding trails and survey points. The first couple of weeks were fine. The weather was decent, the wildlife was normal. Occasional deer, squirrels, raccoons, maybe a bear at a distance. Nothing out of the ordinary. Each cabin was quiet, isolated, and felt more or less like what you'd expect from a lonely forest shack. But something shifted when I got to Cabin 3. Cabin 3 was the farthest out of the 5 on my route. It sat near a narrow creek at the bottom of a slope, surrounded by dense pine forest. The road that led there was more of a trail, and I had to drive a company truck part of the way and then hike in with my gear the last mile. It wasn't in bad shape, but there was a different feel to it. The paint on the door was mostly gone, and the wood on the outside looked darker, almost as if it was burned at some point long ago but never cleaned up. The windows were dusty and the steps creaked loud enough to echo when I walked up. I chalked it up to age. Most of these places hadn't been updated in years. Inside, it was the same layout: cot in the corner, desk against the wall, gas stove, heater, lantern, and some shelves with canned food and basic supplies. There was a logbook on the desk like in the others. I flipped through it out of habit. Just scribbles from people who had stayed there over the years. Some notes about trail conditions. One guy wrote about seeing a mountain lion near the western ridge. Someone else mentioned a fallen tree blocking part of the creek trail. Then I saw a short entry near the back, barely legible, like it had been scribbled quickly. Noises at night? Check ceiling? Stood out, but I didn't dwell on it. Could have been anything: rodents, wind, branches scraping. I'd been in enough of these cabins to know how they groan and creak with the weather. The forest settles around them and you learn to tune it out. That first night was quiet. Cold, but quiet. I set up my gear, warmed a can of soup on the stove, checked my radio, and laid down on the cot with a book. I dozed off by around 10. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized it was because something had fallen. It was faint, but distinct. A soft thud, like something light dropping to the wooden floor. I sat up and looked around. The cabin was dimly lit from the moon through the window. I didn't see anything out of place, but I got up and walked around anyway. My backpack, which I had left on the shelf, was on the floor. Not tipped over, just placed there. It was weird because I remembered putting it high up, away from the stove. I put it back, chalked it up to it maybe not being balanced properly, and went back to bed. The next day, I spent hiking to the creek junction and checking a weather station that had been giving erratic readings. Nothing major, just needed to adjust the solar panel and brush off some debris. It took a few hours, and when I got back to the cabin in the afternoon, I noticed the lantern on the desk had been moved. I knew for a fact I had left it on the far corner near the logbook, but now it was closer to the edge of the desk, facing the opposite wall. I didn't understand how that could happen unless I had done it and forgot, but that didn't feel right. I was sharp about where I put things, especially in a small space where knocking something over could mean damaging gear. Still, I let it go. I figured I was just tired from the hike. That night was different. It started with the floorboards. They creaked in a pattern, like someone stepping carefully across the room. At first I thought it was wind, but the rhythm was off. It wasn't the random flexing of wood. It was steady like steps. I sat up again and looked around. Nothing. The room was still. My pack was on the shelf, the lantern was on the desk where I left it. I walked over to the door and opened it. Cold air rushed in, but the porch was empty. I walked outside with my flashlight, sweeping it across the trees. Nothing moved. Back inside, I sat at the desk for a while with the lantern on, listening. I heard faint rustling from the back wall. Could have been mice, but it didn't sound like skittering. It was more like dragging, like something soft being pulled slowly along wood. I waited. It stopped after a minute or two. The next morning, I found my boots, originally near the door, stacked beside the bed, heel to toe. Not just moved, arranged. That was the tipping point. I knew I hadn't done that. Nobody else was out here. I checked in with base every evening, and they had no one else assigned in this section of the forest. I even looked for signs around the cabin, tracks, disturbed leaves, anything. But the ground was undisturbed, just old pine needles and frost. I kept my head down that day, did my checks, and avoided the cabin as much as I could. When I returned in the afternoon, everything looked untouched. But inside, something felt off. It was colder. Not just from the weather, it was like the air itself was different. Still, pressed in. I tried to distract myself by reading, but I kept glancing at the corners of the room. That night, I didn't sleep much. The sounds returned, more deliberate. Groans from the walls, low pops from the ceiling beams, and once, a faint tapping. I lay there stiff as a board for hours, eyes wide in the dark, barely blinking. By morning, my gear was rearranged. My socks, which I had left on the cot's footrail to dry, were hanging from the lantern hook. A spoon from my mess kit was resting on top of my radio. None of it made sense. I packed everything up before breakfast. My assignment wasn't done for another day, but I wasn't going to spend another night there. I filled out a report at the main station later that week, listing possible wildlife disturbance and equipment interference, just to document it. But I didn't tell them everything. I didn't mention how I started to feel watched. Not the kind of eyes in the woods feeling you get when you know animals are nearby, but something deeper, something that made my skin crawl even during the day. I didn't say how I would find the logbook turned to blank pages each morning, even though I always left it closed. Months later, I found out I wasn't the only one. A guy named Alex, who worked the same circuit the year before, left a scribbled note in Cabin 1's logbook during a different trip. I only saw it because I was doing a supply run and flipped through out of curiosity. It said, "If you're going to 3, don't stay overnight. Just don't. Things move in there." He never elaborated. I asked around, but nobody wanted to talk about it. Most just dismissed it as nerves or isolation getting to people. But I know what I experienced, and I know how it felt. It wasn't some ghost, and it wasn't my imagination. Something or someone had been in that cabin while I slept. Maybe someone squatting in the woods watching the cabins. Maybe a past worker who went off the grid and lost their mind. I don't know. But after that trip, I asked to be reassigned to a different region. I never went back to Cabin 3. I don't care what the explanation is. The woods have rules, and when something doesn't feel right, you don't stay longer than you need to. You leave and you don't look back. I had been working seasonal forest contracts for about 6 years. Mostly solitary work, and I preferred it that way. My job was simple. Spend weeks at a time checking trail conditions, maintaining small cabins and observation towers, and doing weather and wildlife logging. It wasn't glamorous, and most people I knew couldn't stand the quiet, but it suited me. There was something about being cut off from the noise of town and surrounded by nothing but trees that felt right. In the spring of 2021, I was assigned a 3-week stretch rotating between a few cabins that dotted the edge of a state-protected forest in the Pacific Northwest. This section wasn't accessible to the public, at least not legally. It was all government-managed land, mostly used for logging surveys and fire risk assessment. The cabins were spaced anywhere from 10 to 15 miles apart, depending on terrain. There were no real roads, just rough maintenance trails you could barely get a truck down. Most of the travel had to be done by foot or ATV. One of the cabins, Cabin 7, was in the most remote section, pushed up against a bluff that overlooked a long, steep drop into dense pine forest. The place had no power, no cell signal, and only the most basic gear. A cot, a stove, a lantern, and an old steel lockbox for tools. I had stayed there a few times before, and while it was a bit more exposed to wind and weather, it was functional. The trail leading to it narrowed at the top, so I always parked the ATV about a half-mile down and hiked the rest. I arrived there in the late afternoon on a cloudy day. The air was damp, and you could tell it had rained recently. The mud was soft underfoot and the trees dripped steadily. The cabin looked the same as always. Gray, weathered boards, a slanted tin roof, and a porch that groaned under every step. I unlocked the door with the same key I'd always used, dumped my gear on the floor inside, and went about setting up. That first night was uneventful. I made some canned stew, jotted down a few notes in my log, and turned in early. The wind picked up during the night, and I could hear pine needles tapping on the windows and branches rustling out back. But that was normal. Out there, everything creaks, shifts, and groans when the weather moves through. The next morning, I did a loop of the nearby trail section and checked some of the erosion flags. It took longer than expected. Lots of blowdown from winter storms, and I got back just before sunset. That's when I noticed the front door was slightly open. Just an inch or so, but definitely not how I had left it. I always pull it shut until it latches, even if I'm just stepping out to take a leak. At first, I figured I hadn't closed it fully. Maybe it hadn't latched. The wind could have pushed it open. That kind of thing happens. But when I stepped inside, I had a strange feeling. The air felt different. Still, not just quiet, there's a difference. I stood there for a moment trying to shake the thought, but I couldn't. I looked around the room. Everything seemed untouched. My gear was where I left it, food was sealed, tools were locked up. Nothing was missing. That night, I went to bed early again. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. 2 or 3 steps, slow and heavy. Then silence. I lay there in the dark, not breathing. My cot was near the back wall, and the only window faced away from the porch. The sound had been unmistakable, boards shifting under weight. The kind of noise that only comes when someone steps on them directly. I stayed still, listening. Nothing, not even wind. I got up quietly and reached for my flashlight. I turned it on, pressed the beam against my jacket to dim it, and slowly stepped toward the door. I paused with my hand on the handle. Everything outside was still. I opened the door fast and swept the light across the porch. Nothing. Just empty boards and damp air. I stepped outside and shined the light across the clearing, down the path that led away from the cabin. Nothing moved. No sounds. No eyes shining back. I checked the ground the next morning. There was no sign of prints, but the ground was hard under the porch from runoff, so it wasn't surprising. I chalked it up to wind again, maybe a heavy branch falling just right. Maybe my own mind messing with me after too many days alone. The next couple of days passed without much incident. I did my rounds, logged weather data, cleared debris, and kept the stove burning at night. But that uneasy feeling didn't go away. I started to catch glimpses of movement just past the edge of the trees. Quick shifts in light or a shadow that didn't match the angle of the sun. Every time I looked directly, nothing was there. Once I thought I saw a person, tall, still, just standing behind a tree about 30 yards out. But when I blinked, the spot was empty. I kept telling myself I was just on edge. It was easy to start imagining things when you're isolated like that. Your brain starts to fill in gaps. But then I began noticing more concrete things. The cabin door was open again one afternoon when I returned from a trail check. This time it was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. I was absolutely certain I had locked it. I kept the key looped on my belt. I did a full check inside. Again, nothing was missing, but small things were off. My notebook was moved from the desk to the floor. My boots, which I'd left neatly by the door, were sitting by the cot. My water bottle was capped, but lying on its side. That night, the footsteps returned. Slower this time. 1 or 2 steps, then silence. Then, minutes later, another few. It felt like whoever or whatever it was circling the cabin. I sat there with the flashlight in my lap, my back to the wall, staring at the door. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I found the front door open again. I hadn't heard it move. It hadn't creaked, but it was wide open. The air inside the cabin was freezing. My sleeping bag was unzipped. The stove was cold, even though I had it burning when I finally laid down. I packed up my gear that morning and made a quick trip to cabin 6, about 8 miles away, just to get space. It wasn't part of my planned rotation that week, but I needed to regroup. The moment I stepped inside that other cabin, I felt like I could breathe again. After a day or two, I convinced myself to go back and finish the job. I had gear there, and I couldn't just abandon the post. I arrived back at cabin 7 late in the day. The lock was still in place, but inside, things were worse. My bedding was gone. Folded clothing was scattered on the floor. The logbook was missing. The first aid kit had been opened and its contents dumped out in a corner. None of this made any sense. I searched the area around the cabin. No sign of anyone. No tracks, no trash, no paths leading away. I stayed outside until dark, trying to get up the nerve to spend one more night inside. When I finally went in and latched the door, I placed my gear in front of it, piled up a small barricade. It wouldn't stop anyone really determined, but it gave me a little peace of mind. That night, I heard the footsteps again. More of them this time, around the entire porch. Slow, deliberate, then a loud creak, like pressure on one of the steps. I stayed in the cot, clutching my flashlight and waiting for something, anything to follow. But nothing did. After a while, the sound stopped. Just before sunrise, I heard the softest sound, metal on metal. I looked over and saw the lockbox lid slowly close on its own. That was it. I left the cabin that morning with everything I could carry and hiked all the way back to the station over 12 miles without stopping. I didn't report what happened in full, just said there were signs of possible vandalism and that the lock seemed compromised. Later, I found out there had been similar reports from other workers, quiet ones off the books. People seeing shapes near the tree line, hearing someone breathing outside the walls at night, finding doors open. One guy quit after someone knocked on the door at 3 a.m., but no one was there when he opened it. No one ever found proof. No photos, no video, no solid footprints. Could have been a squatter, sure, or maybe someone living way off the grid and watching the cabins. But that place made me feel like I was being studied, not hunted, not threatened, just observed, like something out there was always just behind the trees, waiting to see what I'd do next. I never went back to that cabin after the contract ended. I requested assignments in southern districts, closer to towns. Less isolation, fewer remote spots. I still work in forestry, but I don't stay overnight anymore if I can help it. I've seen what happens when the woods close in around you, when you realize how far you really are from help. When the door you know you locked swings open anyway, and you realize you aren't alone. Not really. You never were. I have always been someone who enjoyed the quiet and the solitude of the wilderness. Over the years, I took every chance I could to get away from towns, roads, and crowds, seeking out cabins deep in the forest where I could spend days or weeks alone. The peace was something I craved after years of city life, and the remoteness was a kind of therapy for me. But that one trip changed how I see isolated places forever. I wasn't alone in feeling that way, of course. There's a whole group of people, workers and hikers and forest rangers, who have stories about the cabins scattered across those wild parts of the country. These aren't the kind of stories you hear around a campfire with ghosts or monsters. They're different, quiet, unsettling, and real. They usually start with a cabin, a locked door, and some noise or movement that just doesn't add up. People hearing footsteps on porches when no one should be there. Finding doors open in the morning even though they locked them tight at night. Seeing strange figures just outside the tree line, always far enough away to be unsure, but close enough to send a chill down your spine. I heard a few of those stories before my trip, but I never really thought much of them. Most people who spend time in the backcountry get weirded out sometimes. You start noticing things when there's no one else around for miles. Animals, the wind, your own mind playing tricks. But the stories I heard were consistent and too detailed to ignore. So when I finally had the chance to spend 2 weeks in a remote cabin about 20 miles from the nearest road, I thought I'd be prepared. The cabin was old, but solid, built decades ago and still standing thanks to regular maintenance from the forestry department. It had the basic essentials: a wood stove, a bunk bed, a small kitchen area, and a sturdy door with a heavy lock. No electricity, no running water. The nearest neighbor was a ranger station, 2 days hike away. The first few days were peaceful in that perfect way. I woke with the sun, brewed coffee on the stove, and spent the mornings exploring the trails. Evenings were spent reading by the fire or jotting notes in my journal. No phone signal, no distractions, just the sound of birds and the wind moving through the trees. But soon enough, I started noticing small things that didn't feel right. It began with noises at night. Footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, just outside the windows. At first, I thought it was animals, deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sounds were too heavy, the steps too spaced out. Animals don't walk in that way, not on wooden boards. One night, I stayed awake for hours listening. The steps came and went, circling the cabin, never breaking the rhythm of the forest, but always there. I checked the porch each morning. Nothing was out of place. No footprints in the soft earth nearby, no dropped items or signs of disturbance. The cabin was locked tight every night, but each morning, the door was sometimes slightly ajar. Not open wide, just enough to let the wind slip through or someone slip in. The worst was the feeling. Not fear exactly, but a creeping sense of being watched. I would be outside chopping firewood or collecting water from the stream, and just beyond the trees, I could swear I saw figures watching me. Tall, thin, always standing still. When I looked directly, they vanished. I would turn my head and see them again when I looked back. It was impossible to tell if it was a trick of the light or shadows, but it was consistent every day. I tried to keep a routine, hoping that staying busy would keep my mind off those feelings. But the isolation was wearing on me. On the 5th day, I found my gear moved. My backpack was zipped shut, but a water bottle was sitting on the porch railing when I had left it on the ground. My boots, which I left outside the door neatly, were now scattered across the porch. I hadn't heard a thing. I was the only one around. There were no tracks anywhere near the cabin. I felt trapped. The forest, which had been a sanctuary, now seemed like a maze closing in on me. I made sure to lock the door extra tight every night, wedging a chair against it for good measure. But the noises persisted. Sometimes I would hear the scraping of wood, like nails or a stick dragged along the walls or windows. I stayed inside, trying to ignore it. On the 7th night, I woke to find the door wide open. The chair was knocked over, lying on its side. My heart pounded, but I stayed still. No one was there. No signs of forced entry, no footprints on the porch. Just the cold night air blowing through the cabin. I closed the door and locked it again, but sleep didn't come. The next day, I packed my things, planning to leave early the following morning. But before I could get a decent night's rest, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, steady, circling the cabin's perimeter. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside, and scanned the trees. Nothing but shadows. I called out, but the forest swallowed the sound. The next morning, I discovered something unsettling. The firewood pile, stacked neatly when I arrived, was knocked over and scattered. My journal lay on the ground, open to a page I hadn't written on yet. The pages were damp, but the writing was still clear. Whoever or whatever had been there had been inside my cabin, going through my things. But I never heard a door creak or a window slide open. I left immediately after that, hiking back to the ranger station as fast as I could without risking injury. Back in civilization, I shared my experience. The rangers told me I wasn't alone. Others had reported similar incidents in the area. Strange figures seen just beyond the tree line. Doors found open despite being locked. Footsteps heard on porches with no one in sight. They told me these experiences were part of the wilderness. The kind of quiet dread that comes when you realize how vulnerable you are in the woods. How easily someone could watch you from the shadows and you'd never know until it was too late. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was something else. People. Maybe hunters, trespassers, or drifters living off the grid. But their presence was enough to turn the peaceful wilderness into a place of constant tension. Since that trip, I avoid staying alone in isolated cabins. I stick to trails with other hikers or campgrounds with some kind of oversight. The woods haven't changed. The quiet hasn't gone away. but my feeling of safety has. There's something about those experiences that stays with you. Something that reminds you that when you're out there alone, you are never truly alone, and that realization can be the scariest thing of all. It started as a quiet escape. I'd been craving time alone in the woods, away from the noise and stress of city life. A small cabin rental deep in the forest seemed perfect, a chance to reset, think, and get some fresh air. I had spent the weeks before this trip imagining the peace of solitude. Mornings with birdsong, afternoons reading by the fire, nights under a sky full of stars. It all sounded so peaceful, so safe. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a simple wooden structure built maybe 50 years ago, tucked away on a narrow dirt road that twisted through the trees like a secret path. It had a front porch with a couple of creaky chairs, a stone fireplace inside, and the bare necessities. A small kitchen, a bed, a table, a stove. There was no electricity or cell service, which was part of the appeal for me. No distractions, no interruptions. The first day was exactly as I hoped. I arrived in the afternoon, carrying my bags through the tall grass and under the canopy of pines. The air smelled sharp and clean, with a faint scent of damp earth and pine needles. I unpacked slowly, took a moment to just stand on the porch and listen. The forest was alive with subtle sounds. Leaves rustling, distant bird calls, the occasional snap of a twig. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I settled in quickly, lighting a fire in the fireplace to chase away the chill creeping in with the evening. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, ate slowly while staring out the window at the thick woods surrounding the cabin. As darkness fell, the forest took on a different character. The sounds changed. Night creatures stirred. Somewhere nearby, an owl called out in the distance. The wind shifted, whispering through the treetops. I went to bed early, tired from the hike and the quiet day. The bed creaked under me, the wooden frame cold against my back. I had no idea then what the night would bring. Sometime late in the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. There was no sharp noise, no obvious disturbance. But something felt wrong. The air around me seemed colder, heavier. The silence was deeper, like the forest was holding its breath. I sat up slowly, listening. The cabin was still dark, but I could just make out the faint outline of the windows. That's when I noticed it. The front door, which I was certain I had locked before going to bed, was wide open. Not just cracked ajar, but swung fully open as if someone had come inside and left it like that. My heart started pounding, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I reached for my phone to check the time or call someone, but there was no signal out here. I didn't hear any footsteps or voices inside the cabin. Nothing. No sign that anyone had been there other than that open door. I pulled the blanket closer and stood up cautiously, moving toward the door. Outside, the forest was pitch black, but the moon cast a faint glow that made the trees look like tall shadows reaching into the sky. I shut the door firmly and locked it again, checking it twice. Then I double-checked the back door, also open. Both doors wide open in the middle of the night. I was sure I'd locked both before going to bed. A cold chill ran down my spine. How had this happened? Who could have come near the cabin without me hearing them? The only sounds outside were the usual rustling leaves and distant animal calls. I forced myself back to bed, though my mind wouldn't stop racing. What if someone was still out there? What if they came back? I tried to listen for any sound, but the forest was silent except for the soft sigh of the wind. I eventually fell into a restless sleep, my body tense and alert. The next day, I decided to stay inside as much as possible. I kept the doors locked and windows shut tight, but strange things kept happening. I would hear voices outside at odd times. Low murmurs, laughter, or whispers that carried through the trees but had no clear source. I stepped outside to look for people, but there was never anyone there. No footprints, no signs of recent visitors. Just the forest, empty and still. One afternoon, I was chopping firewood near the edge of the clearing when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I froze and turned slowly. Between the trees, just beyond the cabin's light, I saw a figure. a dark, shadowy shape standing motionless. It was tall, slender, and human-shaped but too blurry to make out details. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a deer or a pile of branches shaped by shadow. But deep down, I knew what I saw. I felt eyes watching me from the woods, and it wasn't the normal wildlife. Every time I looked around, I caught glimpses of those shadowy figures, darting between the trees, disappearing when I tried to focus on them. The nights got worse. Every evening, just after sunset, I heard voices again. Not just whispers, but fragments of conversations, laughter, sometimes sobbing, always faint and distant. I'd stand on the porch trying to locate the source, but the sounds would shift, coming from one side of the forest, then another, always just out of reach. One night, I woke up once more to find all the cabin doors wide open again. It had happened twice now, both times without any sign of how or why. I checked the perimeter with a flashlight, shining into the thick trees and underbrush. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbed earth. Just the endless forest stretching into darkness. The isolation was starting to get to me. My nerves frayed with every strange sound, every glimpse of movement in the woods. I felt hunted, watched, though I knew no one could have gotten close without leaving a trace. The cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. On the fourth night, I barely slept. I kept the doors locked and windows barred. But around midnight, I heard the voices again, this time much closer. They were louder, clearer, and unmistakably human. Whispered phrases like, "He's here," and "Don't look." The fear rooted me to the spot. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the trees. The light caught something moving, a figure slipping between the trees, tall and quick. I called out, but my voice sounded small and useless in the vast forest. The figure disappeared into the shadows. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the porch, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. At dawn, I packed my bags. I wasn't going to wait another night. Before leaving, I walked the perimeter once more, searching for signs of whoever or whatever had been out there. I found nothing but undisturbed ground, broken branches from animals, and the same endless forest. No footprints, no trash, no signs of human presence. The whole experience left me shaken. The forest felt alive in a way that was more threatening than peaceful. The open doors, the voices with no source, the shadowy figures, they weren't figments of imagination. Something had been there, watching, maybe even entering the cabin while I slept. I still don't know what it was or why it happened. Maybe it was a person or group of people living in the woods nearby, watching the cabin for reasons unknown. Maybe it was a warning to stay away. Whatever it was, it wasn't supernatural. It was real, tangible, and it left an impression on me that won't fade. Since then, I haven't gone back to the cabin or any place that isolated. The woods have a beauty, yes, but also a darkness. A reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see clearly, the ones just beyond your sight, watching silently and waiting. And that's the kind of fear that doesn't need ghosts to feel very real. I've always been drawn to the quiet. Ever since I was young, the idea of being alone in nature, far from cars, cities, and people, has calmed me in ways nothing else can. I've done solo hiking and backcountry camping trips every year since I was 22. I learned how to read a map, follow a compass, purify water, store food properly, and stay aware of the weather and my surroundings. I took pride in doing these trips alone, relying on nobody but myself. I like to go deep, to the kinds of places where you don't see another person for days, sometimes weeks. This happened during a long hike through a national forest in the northern part of the country. I won't say where exactly, because part of me still doesn't know how to explain what I found, and I'm not trying to draw attention to that place. It was the 4th week of September. Cool days, colder nights. Most of the bugs were gone, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I planned a loop route that would take me about 12 days. I had a solid pack, 10 days of food, and the plan to hunt or fish the last couple days if needed. I checked in with the ranger station and filled out the backcountry permit like always. No one else was on the log for the areas I was passing through. The first few days were peaceful. Mornings were filled with bird calls and mist rising off the rivers. I passed old trails barely visible under fallen leaves and followed the ridgelines for miles. I camped near lakes with water so still it looked like glass. I didn't see another person, not even a boot print or a candy wrapper. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. On the 5th day, I took a detour. There was a cutoff trail that led deeper into a part of the forest that had been closed for a while due to wind damage and downed trees. The closure notice was gone, and I figured the trail was probably fine by now. I had time, and curiosity got the better of me. The area wasn't on my map in much detail, just rough topography and an old dotted line for the trail. I figured I'd hike in 5 or 6 miles and then circle back to my main route. About 3 miles in, I started noticing changes. The trail faded almost completely, and the forest around me felt denser. Not darker exactly, but tighter. More underbrush, more closed-in branches, fewer signs of deer or small animals. I stopped seeing scat or tracks. The silence was heavier. The only thing I heard was the occasional creak of the wind moving through the trees. It was later in the afternoon when I came across the cabin. It wasn't on the map. There was no sign of it until I rounded a bend near a small stream and saw it sitting maybe 30 yards off the trail, hidden behind a patch of tall spruce. It was a squat structure, made of old weathered logs, with a metal chimney and a sagging front porch. The roof looked intact, though the edges were heavy with moss. The windows were dusty but not broken. I figured it was some long-abandoned trapper's cabin or maybe a ranger station from way back. I approached slowly. Most places like that are empty, left behind decades ago and barely standing. But as I got closer, I noticed things that didn't fit. There was no dust on the steps. The door was closed but looked recently handled. No cobwebs on the handle or frame. A small stack of firewood was piled to the left of the door, neatly cut and stacked. The wood was dry, split evenly. Not fresh, but not old either. I circled around the cabin. No signs of recent campfires or tire tracks. Just that wood stack and a small metal bucket sitting upright by the back wall. I walked back to the front and gave the door a push. Creaked but opened easily. Inside, the air was dry and smelled faintly of old wood smoke. Not moldy, not stale. The first thing I noticed was the table, clean, wiped down, with nothing on it. The floor was swept. There were 2 chairs, a narrow bed with folded blankets, and a wood stove. A lantern sat on a shelf. Everything was in place like someone had left just minutes ago. There were no personal belongings in plain view, no clothes or food or gear, but the signs were there. A small metal pot still sat on the stove. A pair of worn boots were tucked beneath the bed. A wool coat hung on a nail near the door. None of it looked abandoned. It looked like someone had stepped outside and would be right back. I stood there a long time. The light was starting to go dim outside, and I debated staying for the night. It would have been warmer and more comfortable than my tent. But something didn't feel right. I couldn't say exactly what, but I felt like I had entered someone's space. Not a ruin or a remnant, something active. I backed out and pulled the door shut behind me. I camped about half a mile away that night, close enough that I could have returned in the morning, but far enough to feel like I'd put distance between myself and the place. I lay awake for hours, listening. I thought I heard faint crunching in the woods at one point, but it could have been anything. The night passed quietly otherwise. The next morning, I decided to go back. I had to. I wanted to understand what I had seen, if someone was really living out there, or if it was a setup left behind on purpose. I approached carefully, but when I got there, the door was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it that way. Inside, the cabin looked exactly the same, except the coat was gone. The boots were still there. The pot had been moved slightly, like someone had picked it up and set it back down. I checked everything else. No signs of trash or fresh footprints, but the changes were clear. It wasn't abandoned. I didn't go inside again. I stood on the porch for a minute, then turned and left. I moved fast that day, pushing 10 miles before stopping. I wanted to get back to the map trail, the places where hikers had been, even if only rarely. That night, in a spot near a lake, I set up camp and tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself someone probably lived out there, off-grid, and didn't want to be found. It was rare, but it happened. People disappeared by choice sometimes. The next morning, while packing up, I found something tucked under a rock by the base of a tree near my camp. A small, black and white photo. It was worn, curled at the edges, but clear. A man standing in front of what looked like the same cabin. No smile, no caption. Just a photo of someone staring at the camera, hands at his sides, a blank look on his face. I hadn't brought any photos. It hadn't been there the night before. I kept the photo. I don't know why. For the next few days, I pushed harder than I'd planned. Hiking longer, camping shorter. I didn't see anyone, but I kept noticing things. At one site, I found a knife stuck in a tree, blade still clean, handle worn. At another, a rolled-up sleeping bag sitting near the edge of a clearing, dry, clean, not faded. No one camps like that and just walks off without taking their bag. On the 9th day, I found another cabin. This one was smaller, almost sunken into the ground. It was off the trail by a few hundred feet, hidden in a small grove of pines. I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't stopped to refill water from a nearby creek. It was worse than the first. The door was broken, hanging half open. Inside, the place looked ransacked. Clothes were scattered across the floor. Old shirts, socks, a torn sleeping bag. A journal lay open on the table, its pages stuck together with moisture. I picked it up and flipped through it. The entries weren't dated, but they were recent. Talking about someone staying alone, hearing sounds at night, seeing lights in the woods, and finding things moved while they slept. The writing got messier with each page, more frantic. The last few pages were full of scribbles and single words repeated over and over. Watching, move, quiet, gone. I read every page. The last one was just 2 words. They're here. I took that journal and left immediately. I finished the loop 3 days early. I didn't sleep more than a couple hours each night. I felt watched, and once or twice I thought I heard movement just outside my tent. But I didn't stop to check. I just kept moving. Back at the ranger station, I didn't say anything. I returned my permit, nodded to the guy behind the counter, and got in my car. I drove for hours before pulling over at a motel. I spread out the photo and journal pages on the bed. The handwriting in the journal didn't match anything of mine, but on the back of the photo was a single word, scribbled in faint ink, run. I still have them. I don't know who lived in those cabins, or if they're still out there. I don't know if the person in the photo was the writer of the journal or someone else entirely. I don't know why their things were left behind in places so deep in the woods where no regular hiker ever goes. But I do know this, whoever they were real. They were there, and something happened to them. People don't just abandon cabins fully stocked. They don't leave photographs under rocks or journals open on tables unless they're trying to say something, or unless they didn't have time to leave the right way. I haven't been back since. I still go hiking, but never that far, never that deep, and never alone. I stay close to the trails. I watch for signs. I sleep light, and I listen, because I know now, sometimes when you go looking for quiet, you find what others left behind. And sometimes you're not the first person to walk into a place like that, and you might not be the last. I bought the cabin thinking it'd be the best thing I ever did for myself. I'd been living in the city too long, dealing with traffic, bills, noise, and people constantly around me. I wanted something quiet, remote, a place where I didn't have to hear anything but wind, trees, and maybe a stream if I got lucky. I found a small off-grid cabin through a listing online. It was in northern Montana, about 2 hours from the nearest small town, tucked back off a dirt road that hardly anyone used. No power, no plumbing, just a wood stove, a rainwater collection system, and a propane tank for cooking. The cabin sat on 15 acres, all thick woods, tamarack, pine, and birch. It had a slanted metal roof, a wraparound porch, and 2 small windows on either side. Inside was just a main room with a bed and stove, a table near the window, and a loft that could sleep a guest if someone ever came out there. The outhouse was maybe 30 feet away down a little trail, and there was an old shed a bit farther off that came with the property. The shed was half collapsed when I bought the place. I moved in the fall, September. It was crisp in the mornings, warm in the afternoons, and the air smelled like dry leaves. The first few weeks were exactly what I hoped for. Peace. I chopped wood, cooked simple meals, and slept better than I had in years. I hiked the land and mapped out my property markers with bright tape and a compass. I didn't see a single other person. It was perfect. Started small. Not even weird at first, just off. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got at night. Too quiet. During the day, there were squirrels, birds, the sound of wind in the trees. But as soon as the sun dipped down behind the ridge to the west, it was like something hit a mute button. No bugs, no owls, no distant coyote howls. Just absolute silence. I told myself that was normal. Maybe it was just a quiet part of the year. I kept busy and didn't let it get to me. Then one morning, I found tracks around the cabin. Not human, not boots or shoes. They looked like animal prints, but not quite right either. Some looked like coyote or fox, but others had strange patterns, like a paw but wider, and some with long claw marks dragging through the dirt. I figured it could have been a raccoon or even a bear. Bears were common enough in that part of Montana. I swept the dirt around the cabin with a branch to smooth it out, just to see if more would show up. Over the next few days, they did. The same prints again and again, circling the cabin, coming right up to the porch. I started keeping my axe inside with me. Nothing had happened, but I felt uneasy. I wasn't used to being so alone, and I thought maybe I was just spooking myself. About a week later, I was coming back from a long walk through the woods when I saw something in the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer. It was standing about 50 yards off, just beyond a thick patch of underbrush. But when I looked closer, it wasn't shaped right. It stood lower, stockier, and it wasn't moving like a deer does. It was just still, completely still. I stopped walking and stared at it, but it didn't move or flinch. Eventually, I looked away, started walking again, and when I glanced back, it was gone. That night, I locked the door and shut the windows, even though it was stuffy inside. I kept the axe by the bed. The silence pressed in harder than ever. It wasn't just quiet. It was like everything was holding its breath. The next morning, one of the jugs I used to collect rainwater was missing. I kept them lined up by the corner of the cabin, under a slanted piece of tin roofing. One was just gone. Not tipped over, not chewed on or cracked, just gone. I looked for drag marks, paw prints, anything, but the ground was undisturbed. I searched the woods nearby, but nothing turned up. I ended up moving the remaining jugs inside. A couple nights later, I woke up to a thud on the porch, a single solid sound. I laid there in the dark, barely breathing, listening. Nothing followed it. No steps, no shuffling. Just that one dull impact. I didn't go to the window. I didn't want to see anything. I waited until sunrise before stepping outside. And when I did, one of my boots was gone from beside the door. The other one was still there. I found it 30 feet away, half buried in pine needles. That was when I stopped brushing things off. It wasn't just animals. It wasn't just me being nervous. Something was off around that place. I didn't want to leave, not yet. I'd invested so much into getting away from everything, and part of me still believed it would pass, that it was just a phase of wilderness adjustment. So I started writing things down. I made notes of what went missing, what sounds I heard, what tracks I saw. More things vanished. A mug from the table, a box of matches I kept near the stove, an old folding knife I used for opening packaging. Not all at once, just one item here or there, every few days. Sometimes I'd find them again days later, out in the woods, sitting on a stump or half buried in the dirt. Other times they never came back. I didn't have any signs of break-ins. No forced doors, no smashed windows. Nothing to explain how these things moved. Then came the lights. I was sitting outside one evening, just after sunset. I had a small fire going in the pit I built, and I was drinking tea, watching the last bit of orange fade from the sky. That's when I saw a flicker between the trees, far off, maybe 100 yards. It wasn't firelight, more like a white-blue flash. Then another, a little closer. It wasn't moving like a flashlight would. It would appear, then blink off and reappear in a different spot. I watched it for almost 20 minutes. It didn't follow a path. It didn't make a sound. Then it vanished altogether. I waited until full dark before going inside and locking up. The next morning, I walked to where I thought I saw the lights. Nothing, just woods. I started noticing the lights more often after that, never close, never with sound. Sometimes they blinked out before I could even be sure I saw them. One night, I stayed up late, hoping to catch sight of whatever was causing it. Around 2 a.m., I saw movement from the corner window. A figure moved between two trees, low to the ground. It was too big to be a coyote, too quick to be a bear. I turned off my lantern and stood there in the dark, watching, heart hammering in my chest. The figure stopped halfway between the trees and stayed perfectly still. Then it dropped lower like it was crouching. I didn't see eyes or features, just the shape, the motion, the stillness that followed. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner with my axe in my lap and the lantern off. I thought about leaving, but I didn't know where I'd go in the dark. I waited for morning. A few days later, I hiked down the ridge to check the game trail cameras I had set up near the southern edge of the property. I wasn't a hunter, but I liked seeing what wildlife came through. When I got there, the cameras were gone. The straps were still wrapped around the trees, and the buckles were snapped, like someone had cut them off clean. I found the cameras later, tossed into a thicket over a quarter-mile away. Batteries pulled out, memory cards gone. After that, the behavior of animals changed. Birds stopped coming near the cabin. I didn't hear woodpeckers or see squirrels anymore. The deer that sometimes wandered through avoided the clearing altogether. Once I found a dead rabbit hanging from a branch about 6 feet off the ground. Not eaten, not bloodied. Just hanging by its back legs, tied there with what looked like strips of bark. I didn't go near it. I didn't touch it. I packed a bag and drove into town the next day. I stayed in a motel and considered selling the place right then and there. But after a few days, I convinced myself again that it was just animals. Maybe a person messing around, maybe some survivalist living off the grid nearby. I went back, but I started carrying my rifle everywhere. The last incident is what finally made me leave. It was in late October. Cold had started creeping in. I was splitting logs near the shed when I heard a crunch behind me. Not a twig snapping, a footstep. I turned, expecting to see a deer or maybe a bear. There was nothing, just trees. I walked a slow circle around the cabin. Nothing. But when I came back, the axe I had been using was gone from the stump. I hadn't heard it fall. I hadn't set it anywhere. It was just gone. I stood there for a long time, heart thumping so hard I could feel it in my neck. I went inside and locked the door. That night, I heard something walk the full perimeter of the cabin, step by step. I couldn't tell how many legs it had. Could have been 2, could have been 4. The porch boards creaked once, just once. Then silence. I didn't sleep. In the morning, the axe was back, sitting upright against the porch railing, perfectly clean. I hadn't cleaned it. It was still damp from the morning dew. I left that day. I drove into town and never went back. I put the cabin up for sale through a real estate agent and took a hit on the price just to be done with it. I didn't tell them everything. I just said I had a change of plans. Sometimes I still wonder who or what was out there. I've read stories since. People who live off-grid, who talk about strange lights,